It was a Thursday evening when my daughter, Emily, called. I remember because I was sitting on the porch, fixing an old radio that hadn't worked in years. Her voice sounded unusually bright, the kind of tone she uses when she's trying to sell me on something. "Dad," she said, "Mark's firm is having a family day this Saturday. You should come. Meet his coworkers, see where he works. It'll be nice." I laughed. "Sweetheart, what would I do there?" "Those are all finance people. I'd stick out like a sore thumb." She paused. "You wouldn't. You'd just be there. He really wants everyone to see we're a close family." I could already picture Mark's forced smile. I'd known him for 6 years, and in all that time I'd never felt he liked me much. I wasn't embarrassed about who I was. I'd spent most of my life running a small construction company, working with my hands, doing honest labor. But Mark was the type who measured people by their shoes and watches. Every time I saw him, he'd make some backhanded remark about my retirement hobbies, or how I must miss the good old days of blue collars and hard hats. Still, for Emily's sake, I said yes. Saturday morning came, and I put on my best outfit, a pressed shirt, clean jeans, and the old leather jacket my wife had bought me before she passed. I even polished my shoes. When I arrived at the glass building downtown, I felt a little small. Everything inside gleamed: chrome railings, floor-to-ceiling windows, people in crisp suits holding lattes. Mark spotted me from across the lobby. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, there's my father-in-law," he said, patting my shoulder like he was greeting a customer. "Glad you could make it? You found the place okay?" "I did," I said, trying to match his tone. He led me around, introducing me to people with that smug grin plastered on his face. "This is my wife's dad," he'd say, pausing just long enough before adding, "He's retired now, used to run a small contracting business, built a few houses here and there." The way he said small stung. I'd built over 200 homes, managed dozens of employees, survived 2 recessions. But to him, I was just a handyman. I smiled politely, shook hands, and tried to focus on Emily, who kept glancing at me like she knew I was uncomfortable. There was a moment when one of Mark's colleagues, a younger guy, asked me what I did before retirement. Before I could answer, Mark jumped in. "Oh, he's great with tools. If you ever need a deck built or a fence fixed, he's your guy." The group laughed and Mark joined in the loudest. I wanted to leave right then, but I caught Emily's eyes. She looked embarrassed, almost pleading. So I stayed. While he droned on about investment portfolios and client retention, I drifted toward the back of the room where a small group stood quietly. That's when I noticed a man watching me, older than Mark, dressed simply but with confidence. He smiled faintly, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't think much of it then, but that man's face and that look would change everything before the day was over. If I'd known how that afternoon was going to unfold, I would have walked right out the door when Mark started with his little jokes. It began innocently enough. Someone asked him how he and Emily met, and he gave his usual charming speech about networking at the right time. But then he gestured toward me and said, "Her dad wasn't too sure about me at first. Thought I was just some guy in a fancy suit trying to impress his daughter. Guess I proved him wrong, huh?" Everyone laughed politely, including me, though I could feel my face getting warm. Then came the tour. He was showing a group of guests around, including me, pointing at screens and offices, using all his buzzwords: capital flow, diversified holdings, strategic partnerships. I didn't say a word. I knew I didn't belong there, but I also didn't deserve to be treated like a museum exhibit. When the group reached the conference area, one of his co-workers, a woman, probably in her late 20s, smiled and asked me if I understood any of it. She was being kind, I could tell. But before I could respond, Mark cut in with a grin. "Don't worry," he said. "My father-in-law's more of a hands-on guy. You know, hammer, nails, sawdust. Not spreadsheets?" The crowd chuckled again. Even Emily forced a nervous smile. I just stood there, pretending it didn't sting, pretending it didn't make me feel small. But then Mark went further. They had a display up on a projector, a fake investment challenge, where guests could make pretend trades. I wasn't interested, but Mark insisted I try it. "Come on, let's see what the blue-collar strategy looks like," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. People laughed again, and something inside me broke a little. I sat at the computer, hands awkward on the mouse, trying to follow the instructions. My eyesight isn't what it used to be, so I leaned close to the screen. Mark stood over me, snickering. "He's probably looking for a hammer icon," he whispered to one of the guys. I froze. I heard it clear as day, the kind of insult that's meant to humiliate, not tease. When I looked up, I caught my daughter's eyes. She was mortified. "Mark, stop," she said quietly, but he just waved her off. "Relax, it's just a joke," he said, grinning for the crowd. Something in me, that old pride I'd buried years ago, started to rise. I didn't say anything, though. I finished the fake trade, clicked a few random buttons, and stood up. "There," I said flatly. "Didn't lose a dime." A few people laughed politely again, and the group moved on. But then I noticed that same older man from before, the one who'd been watching me earlier. He wasn't laughing. In fact, he looked at Mark with a strange expression, almost disappointed. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod, like he understood more than anyone else in that room. That was the first moment I felt the tide shifting, though I didn't know how much yet. After the tour, they served lunch in a big open hall with long glass tables and fancy catering. I found a quiet corner near the back, hoping to avoid more of Mark's showmanship. Emily came over, apologized under her breath, and said, "He doesn't realize how he sounds sometimes." I just nodded. "He does," I said quietly. "He just doesn't care." She didn't argue, just looked down and stirred her coffee. That's when the man I'd noticed earlier walked over. He was tall, silver-haired, maybe in his late 50s. His suit wasn't flashy, but you could tell it was tailored. He had the kind of calm confidence I used to see in seasoned businessmen, the kind who didn't need to brag. He stopped in front of me with a warm smile. "Excuse me," he said. "I couldn't help overhearing your name earlier." "You're Mr. Carter, right? Emily's father?" I stood, shook his hand. "That's me," I said. "And you are?" He smiled wider. "James Hollis. I work here too, though not quite as loudly as your son-in-law." That made me chuckle. "You noticed that, huh?" "Hard not to," he said. "He's enthusiastic." I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. There was a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, maybe even recognition. "Carter," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the sound of it. "You wouldn't happen to have been in construction years back, would you?" "Carter Builders?" My chest tightened a little. "Yes," I said. "That was me." His eyes lit up. "I knew it," he said, snapping his fingers. "I worked for one of your subcontractors back in the early 2000s, Fairway Electric. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. You ran that company like a family, always paid fair, even when times were tough." I stared at him, genuinely stunned. I hadn't heard anyone mention that name in years. "Fairway," I said, shaking my head. "Now that's a blast from the past." He laughed. "We did a lot of jobs for you. Those lakefront houses on Pine Ridge, my first big project. We started talking about the old days, the housing market crash, the people we'd known. For the first time that day, I felt like myself again. Like I wasn't just the handyman in the room full of suits." Then, halfway through our conversation, Mark walked up behind me. "Ah, James," he said too cheerfully. "I see you've met my father-in-law." James looked at him evenly. "Yes, we've been catching up." "Didn't realize your father-in-law was the Carter from Carter Builders?" Mark blinked. "The what?" James smiled, amused. "You didn't know?" "He used to own one of the biggest independent construction firms in the state. Built half the high-end properties around here before 2010. Mark laughed awkwardly, glancing at me like he wasn't sure if it was a joke. "You're kidding, right?" I said nothing, just watched his smile fade a little as James went on. "It's true," James said. "Back when I was starting out, your father-in-law's name actually meant something in this business. He clapped me on the shoulder. Still does, to some of us." Mark tried to laugh it off, but I could see the confusion and maybe a little panics in his eyes. For once, he didn't have a witty comeback. That was the moment everything shifted. The tone, the looks, the way people around us suddenly listened when I spoke. It wasn't revenge yet, not even close. But I could tell, something inside that polished office had cracked. After that short exchange with James, I could feel the atmosphere in the room change, just slightly, but enough that even Mark noticed it. Suddenly, people who hadn't bothered to glance my way earlier were looking over with polite smiles. James had that effect. People respected him, even the ones who didn't fully understand why. Lunch wrapped up, and Mark tried to regain control of the narrative. "Let's head upstairs," he said to the group. "We've got a presentation starting." James gave me a look. "You should come," he said. "It's more interesting than the sales pitch your son-in-law's been rehearsing all week." Emily looked nervous. "Dad, are you sure you want to?" I smiled. "Why not?" Upstairs, the conference room had glass walls overlooking the city. I took a seat in the back. Mark was up front, chatting with a few co-workers. I could tell he was tense now, glancing at me every few seconds, his laugh coming out too loud, too sharp. James sat down beside me. "He's got potential," he said quietly, "but too much ego for his experience." "We've had a few conversations about that," I raised an eyebrow. "You're his co-worker?" He chuckled softly. "Not exactly." He tapped a pen against his notebook. "I'm one of the partners." That caught me off guard. The partner, meaning part owner, top of the chain. I looked at him, and he smiled. "Don't tell your son-in-law I'm the boss just yet." "I'm curious how this plays out." I almost laughed. "You want to see him dig his own grave?" James smirked. "Something like that." When the meeting began, Mark stood in front of a big screen, clicking through slides. He was confident. I'll give him that. Slick, practiced, rehearsed. But the more he talked, the more I could see what James meant. He didn't know when to stop selling himself. Every question, he twisted into an opportunity to talk about his success. Halfway through, one of the other partners asked him about a recent deal, something about a housing development. Mark said, "Oh, I've always said real estate's an easy game once you understand numbers. Anyone can build, not everyone can manage assets." He said it while glancing in my direction. A subtle jab, but I caught it. So did James. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Mark," he said calmly, "since you're talking real estate, do you know who built the Ridgemont Estates development in 2005? Mark blinked. I'm not sure." "Some contractor?" I guess James nodded toward me. "That contractor's sitting right behind you." The room went quiet. Mark turned, eyes wide. "What?" I met his stare evenly. "We built all 48 of those homes. I still remember the plans. Ridge Road, Hillcrest Drive, Lakeview Circle, all mine." You could have heard a pin drop. A few people even murmured, realizing they were sitting with the man behind one of the area's biggest developments. James smiled faintly. "That project's one of the reasons I first went into property investment. I studied how Carter Builders ran. It was one of the few small firms that didn't collapse after the 2008 crash. Smart management." Mark didn't say a word. He just stood there, mouth half open, his presentation forgotten. James turned to me. "Funny how paths cross, isn't it?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, funny how life brings things back around." When the meeting ended, James quietly told me, "Don't leave yet. I'd like a word before you go." Mark overheard, and the color drained from his face. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I knew this. My silence was more powerful than any speech I could give. After the meeting, people scattered, some heading back to their desks, others whispering in corners, pretending not to stare at me. I could feel the shift. The same folks who'd laughed when Mark mocked me were now glancing at him like they'd just realized they'd backed the wrong horse. Emily came up to me first, looking both proud and uneasy. "Dad, that was—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Unexpected?" I said. She smiled weakly. "Yeah, I didn't even know half of that. Why didn't you ever tell me how big your company was?" I shrugged. "You were a kid, sweetheart. You didn't need to know about contracts and payroll and inspections. I just wanted to build things and get home in time for dinner." Before she could say more, James approached. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" "Of course." Mark tried to tag along. "I'll come too." But James held up a hand. "No need, Mark. This is between your father-in-law and me." His tone was polite, but it had weight, the kind of voice that didn't invite argument. We walked to his office, large but not flashy. A few awards on the wall, Framed photos of construction sites, city developments, a younger James shaking hands with mayors and architects. He motioned for me to sit. "You know," he began, "when I realized who you were, I almost couldn't believe it. I remember your company. Carter Builders had a reputation. Quality over profit. That's rare." I smiled a little. "We had our flaws, but we tried to do things right." He nodded thoughtfully. "You did. In fact, your name still carries weight with some of the people I work with. You might not realize it, but the way you ran your business set a standard a lot of us still try to follow." I wasn't sure what to say. Praise like that feels different when you've been invisible for a while. I just nodded. "That's kind of you." James leaned back in his chair. "Let me be honest. I've been watching your son-in-law for months. He's got potential. He's ambitious, driven, but he's reckless, too focused on image, not substance. I was hoping he'd grow out of it." I let out a small laugh. "He's been like that since the day I met him." "I figured," James said. Then he leaned forward slightly. "But seeing how he treated you today, that told me everything I needed to know. That kind of arrogance doesn't just show up at home, it leaks into the work too." I stayed quiet, letting his words hang. James studied me. "Do you mind if I ask something personal?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you say anything when he was mocking you earlier?" "You could have embarrassed him right back." I took a moment. "Because I wasn't there to prove anything." "My daughter loves him. That's her husband. I didn't want to make her choose between us." James nodded slowly, almost respectfully. "You're a better man than most." He stood up then, extending his hand. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. I'm glad we met, and I'm sorry you were treated that way under my roof. That won't happen again." I shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that." When we walked out, Mark was waiting in the hallway, pale and stiff. "What did he say?" he asked immediately. James smiled faintly. "Nothing you need to worry about right now, but we'll be talking soon." Mark's throat tightened. "Sir, if this is about earlier—" James cut him off gently. "Enjoy the rest of your day, Mark." Then he turned to me and said, "It was a pleasure, Mr. Carter." I could feel Mark's eyes burning into me as I walked away. That was the quiet before the storm, the moment before the truth began to unravel. The following week, Emily called me sounding nervous. I could hear the strain in her voice before she even said a word. "Dad," she started, "did something happen at Mark's office after you left?" I hesitated. "Why do you ask?" She sighed. "He's been off. Quiet, snappy. Said there was a misunderstanding at work, but he won't tell me what." I had a pretty good idea. I told her gently, "Just give it time, sweetheart." But I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Mark showed up at my house unannounced. I was out in the garage sanding a shelf when I heard his car screech into the driveway. He stormed in without knocking, still in his suit, tie crooked, face flushed. "What did you say to James?" he demanded. I set the sandpaper down. "Good to see you, too." "I'm serious, old man," he snapped. "He's been different with me ever since that day. Won't include me in meetings, barely talks to me. Did you tell him something?" I just looked at him. He was shaking, part anger, part fear. "You did that to yourself," I said finally. "Don't give me that crap," he spat. "You embarrassed me. You think you're better than me because you built some houses 20 years ago?" I stood up, wiping my hands. "No, Mark, I don't think I'm better than you, but I think you forgot what respect looks like. That's what James saw." He laughed bitterly. "Respect? Please, you're a washed-up contractor. You think one old man's story is going to change how people see me?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He took a deep breath, lowering his voice. "He demoted me," he said finally, his tone breaking. "Moved me out of client accounts. Said he didn't like the way I handled relationships." I stayed quiet. He glared at me like it was my fault. "You don't get it, do you? I worked my ass off to get where I am. You think any of those people respect me because of what I do? No, they respect who I know, the image, and you ruined it." I stepped closer, meeting his eyes. "No, Mark, I didn't ruin it. You built it on the wrong foundation." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. For a moment, he looked lost, not angry, not proud, just small. I could almost feel sorry for him. Almost. James called me yesterday, I said quietly. He wanted to thank me. He said that day reminded him why he started the firm, to build something with integrity, not ego. He said he was disappointed he hadn't seen the problem with you sooner. Mark stared at me, jaw tightening. You think this makes you a hero? I shook my head. No, I didn't do anything. I just showed up. He let out a humorless laugh and turned toward the door. You always think you're so righteous. You and Emily both. You'll see, I'll bounce back. You'll regret making me look weak. And with that, he left, tires squealing out of my driveway. I stood there for a while, staring at the sawdust on the floor, thinking about everything he'd said. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel vengeful, just tired. Because deep down, I knew what would come next, the crash he'd brought on himself. It took less than a month for everything to come undone for Mark. Emily called me one evening, her voice trembling. Dad, Mark's been let go. I said nothing for a moment, just listened to her breathing on the other end. He told me it was a strategic restructure, she continued, but then I heard from one of his co-workers, James asked him to step down. Something about his attitude with clients and how he treats people. There it was, the reckoning. When she hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the wood grain, thinking about the first time I met Mark, the way he'd shaken my hand too firmly, the way he'd looked around my modest house like it was beneath him. I'd known what kind of man he was even then, but you can't tell your daughter she's marrying arrogance dressed in a suit. You just hope she'll see it for herself one day. That day came faster than I expected. A week later, he came by again. No car screeching this time. He parked neatly, walked up to the porch, and stood there, hat in hand, literally. His eyes were red, and he looked about 10 years older than he had the last time I saw him. Can we talk? He asked. His voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I nodded and motioned for him to sit. He didn't dance around it. I lost everything, he said quietly. Savings, job, reputation. James said he couldn't trust me with clients anymore, that I don't listen, that I'm performing success instead of earning it. He gave a hollow laugh. That sound familiar? I said nothing. He rubbed his hands together, staring down at his shoes. I know I was an ass to you. I know that. I thought being impressive mattered. I thought if people saw me a certain way, it would make me valuable. I nodded slowly. I used to think the same thing when I was young. But you learn fast. The real thing doesn't need a spotlight. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, there wasn't any pride left in his eyes, just exhaustion. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I just didn't want you to think I got away with it. I leaned back, thinking about it. Life has a way of balancing itself out, Mark. You don't need me to punish you. You already got your lesson. He nodded, eyes glistening. I did. Before he left, he stopped at the door. James told me something, he said. He said you turned down his offer. I smiled faintly. He offered me a consulting role. Said they're launching a real estate division, wanted my advice. I told him I'm done with offices. Mark frowned. Why'd you say no? I looked out at the sunset. Because I don't need to prove anything anymore. Some things are better left built once he didn't answer. Just nodded and walked off the porch quietly. When his car disappeared down the road, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. Sometimes life doesn't need your help to set things right. You just have to let people see who you really are, and let the truth do the rest.